The story of the Spanish galleon begins in an age of immense transformation. Europe was stepping into the dawn of global exploration, when the oceans ceased to be barriers and became vast highways of trade, war, and discovery. The galleon, that great wooden fortress of the seas, stood at the center of this sweeping historical drama. It was more than a ship. It was a symbol of empire, of wealth flowing across continents, of the promise and peril that the sea held for those bold enough to master it. From the 16th to the 18th centuries, the Spanish galleons carried not only goods, but the very lifeblood of an empire. In their cavernous hulls lay silver from Potosi, gold from New Granada, and spices from the distant isles of Asia. These ships linked worlds, the New World with the Old, Europe with Asia, and colonies with the imperial heart of Madrid. For over 200 years, the galleon fleets formed the backbone of Spain's maritime might and the artery through which treasure flowed into Europe. Yet their story is not merely one of riches. It is equally a tale of danger, piracy, shipwreck, and relentless struggle against the sea itself. The same treasures that made galleons desirable made them hunted. Across the Caribbean and the Atlantic, English privateers, French corsairs, Dutch raiders, and later pirates sought to intercept these floating fortresses. The sight of a Spanish galleon on the horizon could mean salvation for the empire, but fortune for its enemies. To understand the galleon, one must first understand the age in which it was born, the age of empire and expansion. The late 15th century had opened the world to Europe in ways unimaginable only decades before. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing under the Spanish crown, had crossed the Atlantic, linking the Old World with the New. The discoveries that followed created an empire unlike any seen before, sprawling across the Caribbean islands, Mexico, Central America, Peru, and stretching toward Asia through the Philippines. Spain, once a divided land of kingdoms, now stood as the greatest imperial power in Europe. But with empire came challenges. The riches of the Americas could not simply lie idle. Silver and gold mined in immense quantities in Peru and Mexico had to be transported safely across vast oceans. Spices, silk, and porcelain from Asia had to be carried from Manila across the Pacific to Mexico, then across the Atlantic to Spain. Each voyage involved staggering distances, hostile seas, and lurking enemies. It was in this crucible of necessity that the galleon emerged, a ship designed not just for commerce, but for survival in a world where trade was war and war was trade. Birth of the galleon concept. Before the galleon, Spain had relied on a variety of ships, caravels, carracks, and naos. Each had its strengths. The nimble caravel had carried Columbus on his voyage of discovery. The carrack, or nao, was a bulkier vessel, ideal for long voyages with heavy cargo. Yet none of these ships alone could fully meet the demands of a global empire. The galleon was born as a synthesis, a response to the needs of the 16th century. It combined the cargo capacity of the carrack with the sleek, elongated hull of the caravel, and it introduced innovations in rigging and artillery placement. What emerged was a vessel both spacious and formidable, a ship capable of carrying immense treasure while bristling with cannon to ward off attackers. The very design of the galleon reflected the empire's dual priorities, commerce and defense. It was not enough for a ship to transport wealth. It had to survive storms, ambushes, and open sea battles. The galleon thus became a fortress afloat, its decks lined with guns, its hull reinforced, its crew drilled not only in sailing, but in combat. Spain's maritime empire. By the mid-16th century, Spain's imperial reach demanded a system of regular organized transport across the oceans. The treasure fleets, known as the Flota de Indias, became the arteries of empire. Twice a year, vast convoys of galleons set sail, one across the Atlantic from Seville or later Cadiz to the Caribbean, and another across the Pacific from Manila to Acapulco. These fleets carried not only treasure but also settlers, soldiers, priests, and supplies, everything required to sustain Spain's far-flung dominions. The Atlantic crossing linked Spain with its colonies in Mexico and the Caribbean. The Pacific crossing, known as the Manila Galleon trade, connected Asia with the Americas, bringing silk, spices, and porcelain from China and the East Indies. Together, these routes formed the first true global trade network, with the galleon as its essential vessel. But the galleons were not invincible. Storms wrecked them, reefs claimed them, and pirates stalked them. Their losses were dramatic and often tragic, searing themselves into legend. Yet for every ship lost, another was built, and the empire's survival depended on them. A world of rivals. The rise of the galleon coincided with an era of fierce rivalry. England, France, and the Netherlands, jealous of Spain's wealth, turned to privateering as a weapon. Figures like Francis Drake became legendary for their daring raids against Spanish shipping. Caribbean waters became a theater of constant skirmish, where Spanish galleons fought to defend their cargoes against marauders who sought to plunder them. At the same time, Spain's enemies recognized the strategic importance of the treasure fleets. To intercept even a single galleon could bring wealth beyond imagining. To destroy a fleet could cripple Spain's economy. Thus, the galleons became both prize and target, their very existence fueling the age of piracy and privateering. The symbolism of the galleon. Beyond their practical role, galleons came to symbolize Spain's imperial grandeur. Their towering stern castles and ornate carvings projected power and majesty. To see a fleet of them riding at anchor in Havana or Manila was to behold the might of the Spanish crown. They were floating palaces adorned with gold leaf and religious iconography, reminders that Spain's empire was not only material but spiritual. Yet, as history would prove, even the greatest ships could not halt the tides of change. The galleons ruled the seas for 2 centuries, but their story would end in obsolescence as new ship designs emerged and Spain's empire declined. Still, their legacy endures in legend, in shipwrecks that continue to yield treasure from the ocean floor, and in the cultural memory of an age when the world was bound together by wood, sail, and the courage of men who dared to cross uncharted seas. The Spanish galleon did not emerge from the imagination of a single shipwright, nor from the drawing board of one visionary engineer. Rather, it was the product of centuries of accumulated knowledge, blended with the urgent demands of empire. Spain, in the 16th century, stood at the crossroads of seafaring traditions. The sleek Mediterranean galleys, the robust northern cogs, the agile caravels, and the heavy-laden carracks. From these diverse influences, the galleon was shaped, an evolutionary step in naval architecture that would dominate the oceans for over 200 years. The vision of a new ship. By the 1550s, Spain faced a growing crisis. Its colonial possessions stretched from Peru to the Philippines, and the wealth they produced had to be transported across oceans teeming with danger. Carracks, or naus, had served faithfully in the early decades of exploration, but they proved clumsy in combat. Their high castles made them unstable in storms, and their broad hulls, though excellent for cargo, were vulnerable to attack. Royal advisors and naval officers pressed the crown for a new design, a ship that could combine the cargo-carrying ability of the carrack with the swiftness and maneuverability of the caravel. It would need to withstand not only the gales of the Atlantic, but also the cannon fire of enemy privateers. In response, Spanish shipyards began experimenting. In Seville, Cadiz, and along the Cantabrian coast, master shipwrights drew plans that elongated the hull, reduced the height of the forecastle, and emphasized stability without sacrificing speed. Slowly, the galleon took form, long, lean, yet strong, with a low bow that cut through waves and a towering stern castle that housed officers, gunners, and the symbols of royal authority. Shipyards of the empire. The construction of a galleon was no small endeavor. Entire communities were drawn into the task. Shipyards at Seville, Cartagena, Barcelona, and later Havana became centers of constant activity. Forests in northern Spain and the New World were harvested for their timbers, oak, pine, and cedar, each selected for its unique qualities. Oak gave strength to the hull, resisting both cannonballs and the gnawing teeth of shipworms. Pine was lighter and flexible, ideal for masts and spars. Cedar provided durability and resistance to rot. In the New World, Havana in Cuba became especially important. Its strategic location in the Caribbean and access to vast forests of tropical hardwood made it a natural hub for shipbuilding. Cuban mahogany and other dense woods gave galleons built there an added resilience, especially useful for ships that would brave the hurricane-prone waters of the Caribbean. The shipyards themselves were scenes of organized chaos. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of artisans labored together, carpenters shaping timbers, blacksmiths forging iron nails and fittings, caulkers sealing seams with pitch and hemp, rope makers twisting endless coils of cordage, and sailmakers sewing vast sheets of canvas. The building of a galleon could take years, each stage marked by rituals, inspections, and blessings. Anatomy of a galleon. A typical galleon was a marvel of its age. The hull was long and relatively narrow, ranging from 30 to 50 meters in length, with a displacement often between 500 and 1,200 tons. Unlike the bluff-bowed carrack, the galleon's bow was sharp and elongated, designed for cutting through heavy seas. The stern rose high, crowned with the ornate stern castle, which contained the captain's quarters, officer cabins, and often a small chapel. The decks were carefully arranged. The lower decks housed cargo, silver ingots, crates of cochineal dye, casks of wine and oil, and all the provisions needed for long voyages. Above them were the gun decks, lined with iron and bronze cannon that gave the galleon its formidable punch. On the upper decks, soldiers and sailors stood ready, muskets and pikes at hand should the ship face boarding. The rigging was a complex web of masts, yards, and sails. Most galleons carried 3 or 4 masts, the foremast and mainmast rigged with square sails for speed, the mizzenmast carrying a lateen sail for maneuverability, and sometimes a small bowsprit sail at the front. This combination gave the galleon both the power to run before the wind and the agility to tack against it, crucial advantages in both trade and war. Innovations in armament. One of the defining features of the galleon was its integration of heavy artillery. Earlier ships had carried cannon, but often these were mounted high, in castles at the bow and stern, where their effectiveness was limited. The galleon introduced the gun deck, rows of cannon set low in the hull, close to the waterline, firing through gun ports cut into the sides. This innovation transformed naval combat. Instead of relying solely on boarding actions, galleons could now deliver devastating broadsides. A large galleon might carry between 40 and 60 guns, a mix of culverins for long-range fire and heavier cannon for close combat. Combined with the ship's sturdy hull, this armament made the galleon one of the most formidable warships of its era. The human element. Yet, a galleon was more than wood and iron. It was a floating community. Crews ranged from 150 to over 300 men, depending on the size and mission of the ship. They included sailors, soldiers, officers, gunners, priests, surgeons, and sometimes women and children traveling to the colonies. Life on board was harsh and disciplined. Sailors slept in hammocks, lived on salted meat and hardtack, and endured long months at sea with little comfort. Despite the hardships, the galleon offered opportunities. For common sailors, it was a chance at steady pay and perhaps a share of prize money. For officers, it was a path to honor and advancement in the service of the crown. For all, it was a life lived on the razor's edge between fortune and disaster. Launching a galleon. When construction was complete, the launching of a galleon was a moment of great ceremony. Priests blessed the vessel, sprinkling holy water on its decks and praying for safe voyages. The ship was named often after saints, royal patrons, or symbols of faith. Names like Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, San José, or Trinidad. The crowd gathered. The great hull slid down the greased timbers of the slipway into the water, where it settled into its element, ready to begin its life of service. Each launch carried with it not only the hopes of the shipbuilders, but also the ambitions of empire. A single galleon might carry the wealth of kingdoms, the lives of hundreds, and the fate of Spain's dominion across oceans. Its design, its construction, and its very presence on the seas testified to the might of the Spanish crown and the reach of its vision. The galleon is a living organism. Once afloat, the galleon was not a static creation, but a living organism. Constant maintenance was required, caulking seams, repairing rigging, replacing sails. In tropical waters, shipworms gnawed at the timbers, forcing ships to be careened, hauled onto their sides for cleaning and repair. Storms damaged masts, battles scarred hulls, and long voyages wore down every component. A galleon's life expectancy was rarely more than 2 or 3 decades, yet in that time it could cross oceans dozens of times, carrying riches and stories that would echo for centuries. In these floating fortresses, Spain found the means to bind its far-flung empire together. The galleon was more than a ship. It was a lifeline, a weapon, a symbol of faith and power. Its birth in the shipyards of Spain and the New World marked the beginning of an era when the seas themselves became the stage for imperial ambition. To understand the Spanish galleon, not only as a vessel of empire, but as a technological achievement, we must look closely at its physical form. Each galleon was the result of careful design, combining the lessons of centuries of seamanship with the demands of a new global age. The galleon was not merely a ship, it was an engineered balance between cargo and cannon, endurance and maneuverability, faith and pragmatism, dimensions and structure. The size of a galleon varied depending on its purpose. Smaller galleons of 300 to 500 tons served as escorts and scouts, while the largest, sometimes exceeding 1,200 tons, were dedicated treasure carriers. Length between 30 and 50 meters, 98 to 164 feet. Beam, width at midship, around 8 to 12 meters to 26 to 40 feet. Draft, depth below waterline, approximately 4 to 6 meters, depending on load. These proportions gave the galleon a long, narrow profile compared to the bulky carrack. This meant greater speed, less wind resistance, and a more stable platform for cannon fire. The hull was reinforced with thick oak planking, often exceeding 30 centimeters in thickness at critical points. Some hulls were doubled, 2 layers of planking, giving extra resilience against both cannonballs and the relentless sea. The ship was divided into watertight compartments by bulkheads, a feature increasingly common in the 16th century. This not only improved structural strength, but also helped contain flooding if the hull was breached. Masts, rigging, and sails. The galleon typically carried 3 or 4 masts. Main mast, the tallest, rigged with large square sails for driving power. Foremast, also rigged with square sails, contributing to speed on the open sea. Mizzenmast carried a lateen sail, triangular, crucial for maneuvering and tacking against the wind. Bonaventure mizzen, on larger galleons, a smaller fourth mast, further aiding control. At the bow, a bowsprit projected forward, often carrying a small spritsail to stabilize the ship. The total sail area of a galleon could exceed 1,000 square meters, a vast expanse of canvas catching the wind. Handling these sails required constant attention from skilled sailors. Every rope, knot, and pulley formed part of a living machine, with the crew working in shifts day and night to keep the ship on course. Armament and gun decks. Perhaps the most revolutionary feature of the galleon was its deliberate integration of heavy artillery. Earlier ships mounted cannon in the high castles where their range and accuracy were limited. The galleon brought these weapons lower, aligning them in broadsides along the gun deck. Number of guns, typically between 20 and 60, depending on size. Types of artillery. Culverins, long-barreled guns for accurate long-range fire. Demi-cannon, heavy guns delivering devastating close-range shots. Falconets and swivel guns, smaller weapons for anti-personnel defense, mounted on rails and parapets. The arrangement of these guns allowed the galleon to unleash a coordinated broadside, a wall of iron and fire capable of crippling an opponent before boarding even began. This innovation heralded the dawn of a new kind of naval warfare, where gunnery, not boarding parties, determined victory. Gun crews trained relentlessly. Loading a cannon was a complex and dangerous process, requiring precision and speed. Powder, shot, wadding, and ignition had to be handled under pressure, often in the chaos of battle. A well-trained crew could fire 2 to 3 volleys in 10 minutes, a devastating rhythm of destruction. Speed and handling. Despite their size and weight, galleons were remarkably agile for their time. A well-designed galleon could achieve speeds of 7 to 9 knots under favorable winds, respectable for an ocean-going vessel laden with cargo and cannon. Their narrow beam, relative to their length, allowed for better tacking, while the combination of square and lateen sails gave versatility. This balance made them not only effective cargo carriers, but also formidable warships, able to outmaneuver slower carracks and withstand rougher seas than smaller caravels. However, galleons were not invulnerable. Their high-stern castles, though reduced from earlier designs, still made them vulnerable to strong crosswinds. In storms, their tall masts could snap under pressure, and while faster than carracks, they could not match the sheer agility of lighter raiding vessels like English pinnaces or Dutch flights. Crew and life aboard the galleon was home to a community at sea. A large galleon might carry between 250 and 300 souls, divided among various roles. Sailors, responsible for rigging, navigation, and steering. Soldiers, armed with muskets, pikes, and swords, ready to repel boarders or fight on shore. Gunners, specialists who manned the cannon, trained in the art of naval artillery. Officers, the captain, master, and pilots who oversaw navigation and discipline. Priests and chaplains, essential on Spanish ships, conducting daily prayers and offering spiritual comfort. Surgeons and carpenters, maintaining health and repairing the ship in battle or storm. Life was grueling. Rations consisted of hardtack, salted meat, beans and wine or water stored in barrels. Fresh food spoiled quickly, leading to widespread scurvy and malnutrition on long voyages. Hammocks were strung in the lower decks, where the air was damp and filled with the smell of tar, salt, and humanity. Despite hardship, there was rhythm and ritual. Bells rang every half hour to mark the passage of time and the change of watches. Hymns were sung at dawn and dusk. The sea, with its endless horizon, became both prison and freedom, binding the crew together in shared danger and hope. Innovations that defined the galleon. Several key features distinguished the galleon from its predecessors. Streamlined hull, longer and narrower than carracks, making them faster and more stable. Lower forecastle, reducing wind, resistance and improving balance in storms. Dedicated gun decks, establishing the broadside as a standard tactic. Mixed sail plan, combining square and lateen sails for versatility. Reinforced stern, offering protection. For officers, symbols of authority, and ornate decoration projecting power. These innovations allowed the galleon to serve both as cargo ship and warship, fulfilling the dual needs of empire, wealth and defense. The symbolic presence of the galleon. Even when not engaged in battle or heavy transport, the very sight of a galleon inspired awe. Their high sterns were often adorned with carvings of saints, lions, or the Habsburg coat of arms. Gold leaf, religious emblems, and elaborate figureheads at the bow reminded all who saw them that these ships sailed not only for profit, but for God and crown. To allies, they were protectors. To enemies, they were obstacles. To those who sailed aboard, they were both home and hardship, filled with the promise of riches and the constant threat of death. Thus, in every plank, sail, and cannon, the galleon represented the height of Spanish naval technology. It was the embodiment of empire, designed for oceans, built for war, and destined to carry the fate of nations. Once launched and fitted out, the Spanish galleon stepped into a life of peril and promise. No two voyages were the same, yet each shared the same mixture of monotony, danger, and glory. For more than 2 centuries, galleons traversed oceans, carrying treasure, men, and goods along routes that spanned the known world. Their service history is a tapestry of trade and war, discovery and loss, a reflection of the empire that relied upon them. The Atlantic treasure fleets. At the heart of Spain's maritime power stood the Flota de Indias, the treasure fleets. Beginning in the mid-16th century, Spain established a system of annual convoys that linked the Old World with the New. Twice a year, great fleets of galleons sailed from Spain to the Americas and back, ensuring that wealth flowed reliably into the coffers of Madrid. The fleet to the Americas usually departed from Seville or later Cadiz in the spring. Laden with European goods, cloth, wine, olive oil, tools and luxury items, it crossed the Atlantic to the Caribbean. From there, ships dispersed to ports such as Veracruz in Mexico or Cartagena in New Granada. The return voyage, known as the homeward-bound fleet, was the most perilous. Galleons gathered in Havana, where they were loaded with silver from Potosí and Zacatecas, gold from Colombia, emeralds, tobacco, and exotic dyes like cochineal. Escorted by war galleons, bristling with cannon, the fleet then made the dangerous passage across the Atlantic, skirting storms and evading privateers. These treasure convoys became the lifeblood of the Spanish Empire. Without them, Spain's armies in Europe would starve for funds, its economy would falter, and its imperial projects would collapse. The Manila Galleon Trade. Equally legendary was the Manila Galleon Trade, linking Asia and the Americas. Beginning in 1565, a route was established between Manila in the Philippines and Acapulco on the Pacific coast of Mexico. This crossing of the Pacific was among the longest and most grueling voyages in the world. 1 or 2 galleons, built larger than most, set sail each year from Manila, loaded with silk, porcelain, spices, and ivory acquired through trade with China and the East Indies. These goods were so precious that a single voyage could yield profits beyond imagination. The return trip carried silver from the mines of the Americas, which was eagerly sought in Asia. Thus, the Manila galleons created the first true global exchange. Silver flowed westward to Asia, while luxury goods flowed eastward to Europe. The voyage was perilous. Galleons faced months at sea without sight of land, enduring scurvy, storms, and starvation. Shipwrecks were frequent, yet the trade endured for over 2 centuries, binding Asia and the Americas in a single commercial thread. Life at sea service aboard a galleon was harsh and monotonous. Days blended into nights as the crew managed sails, kept watch, and endured the endless roll of the ocean. Entertainment was scarce. Sailors sang shanties, told stories, or carved small trinkets from wood. Prayer was constant, with chaplains leading mass and processions to implore divine protection against storms and pirates. Voyages could last months, and conditions tested the endurance of even the strongest men. Fresh water turned foul in barrels, salted meat grew rancid, and disease spread rapidly in cramped quarters. Scurvy, dysentery, and fevers claimed many lives, and burials at sea were grimly routine. Yet there was also pride. To serve on a galleon was to be a part of Spain's imperial machine, to carry the wealth of empires and the faith of the Catholic crown. For many, it was the only life they knew, a life of hardship intertwined with the possibility of fortune and honor. Escort and defense duties. Not all galleons were treasure carriers. Many served as escorts, guarding convoys against attack. These were smaller, more agile vessels, designed for combat rather than cargo. They patrolled the approaches to Havana, Cartagena, and Veracruz, ever watchful for English, French, and later Dutch raiders. At times, galleons formed squadrons to defend entire regions. In the Caribbean, they clashed with privateers and pirates, fought to recapture islands seized by rivals, and patrolled against smugglers who sought to undermine Spain's trade monopoly. Their presence was often deterrent enough. Few captains dared to attack a treasure fleet guarded by half a dozen well-armed galleons. When battles came, the galleons were ready, unleashing broadsides that echoed across the sea. Explorations and expeditions. Beyond commerce and war, galleons also played roles in exploration. They carried settlers to the New World, priests to mission territories, and soldiers to distant outposts. Some were dispatched on expeditions to chart new coasts, seek new routes, or establish contact with distant lands. In 1564, for instance, Miguel López de Legazpi's expedition set out in galleons from Mexico to colonize the Philippines, an endeavor that permanently expanded Spain's reach into Asia. These ships carried not only soldiers and supplies, but also the ambitions of empire, planting Spain's flag in lands half a world away from Madrid. The galleon and war in Europe. While often associated with the Americas, galleons also served in European waters. During Spain's conflicts with England, France, and the Netherlands, galleons joined battle fleets in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. The most famous example came in 1588, when the Spanish Armada sailed against England. Though the Armada ultimately failed, it showcased the role of galleons as both cargo carriers and warships. Their heavy broadsides and robust hulls made them formidable opponents, though they struggled against the nimble English ships that harried them up the channel. This duality defined the galleon, not the fastest ship, nor the largest, but versatile enough to carry treasure across oceans and fight wars when required. Risks and dangers. No voyage was without danger. Hurricanes in the Caribbean could scatter fleets, dashing galleons against reefs. In 1622, the treasure fleet, led by the galleon Nuestra Señora de Atocha, was destroyed by a hurricane off the Florida Keys, sending millions of pesos in silver and gold to the ocean floor. Pirates and privateers were a constant threat. A lone galleon, separated from its convoy, was a tempting prize. In 1628, Dutch Admiral Piet Hein captured the entire treasure fleet in the Bay of Matanzas, seizing cargo worth millions and dealing a staggering blow to Spain. These losses underscored the fragility of empire. Despite their strength, galleons could not master the sea itself, nor the relentless cunning of human adversaries. Service as an imperial network. Despite dangers, the galleon system endured for over 2 centuries, knitting together the farthest reaches of Spain's dominion. From the silver mines of Potosí to the royal treasuries of Madrid, from the markets of Manila to the palaces of Seville, the galleon was the link that held empire together. Each voyage was a gamble, yet the rewards were immense. A single successful fleet could bring wealth to fund wars in Europe, build cathedrals, and sustain armies. For this reason, Spain continued to build, launch, and sail galleons long after newer designs emerged. They were too important to abandon, too central to the imperial dream. Thus, in their service and expeditions, galleons became more than ships. They became arteries of empire, carriers of both treasure and faith, symbols of Spain's reach across the globe. Their voyages wrote chapters of history that endure in memory, in shipwrecks found centuries later, and in the legends of gold, pirates, and storm-lost fleets. The Spanish galleon was never just a ship of trade. It was a target, a weapon, and often the setting of great drama. Across 2 centuries, certain events involving galleons became etched into the annals of history. Moments when the fate of nations, the wealth of empires, or the legends of the sea turned upon these mighty vessels. The Spanish Armada, 1588. Perhaps the most famous appearance of galleons in European waters was during the Spanish Armada. In 1588, King Philip II of Spain assembled a massive fleet to invade England. Among the Armada's warships were numerous galleons, veterans of transatlantic voyages, converted for the great campaign against Elizabethan England. The galleons in the Armada demonstrated both their strengths and limitations. Their sturdy hulls and heavy broadsides made them formidable in close combat. Yet against the nimble English race-built galleons and smaller ships, they struggled. English captains like Francis Drake and John Hawkins avoided boarding actions and instead used long-range gunnery, harrying the Spanish from a distance. When storms scattered the Armada in the North Sea, many galleons wrecked upon the coasts of Scotland and Ireland. Though Spain remained a dominant power, the Armada's failure revealed the vulnerability of even the strongest ships when strategy and weather turned against them. The capture of the Treasure Fleet, 1628. One of the most dramatic blows to Spain's maritime empire came not from storm, but from cunning. In 1628, the Dutch admiral Piet Hein led a fleet into the Bay of Matanzas, off the coast of Cuba. There, he intercepted the Flota de Indias, Spain's treasure fleet, protected by several galleons. The Spanish captains, caught off guard, surrendered without a fight. Hein captured not only the galleons, but also their cargo, silver, gold, and precious goods worth an estimated 12 million guilders. It was the only time in history that an entire treasure fleet was captured intact. The loot financed the Dutch Republic's war effort against Spain and underscored how even the mighty galleons, when isolated, could fall prey to bold enemies. The wreck of the Atocha, 1622. If Piet Hein's capture revealed human cunning, the story of the Nuestra Señora de Atocha showed the raw power of nature. In September 1622, a fleet of galleons left Havana, heavily laden with treasure from the Americas. Among them was the Atocha, carrying an enormous cargo of silver ingots, gold coins, emeralds, and other riches. Just days after departure, a hurricane struck. Winds and waves shattered the fleet, scattering ships across the Florida Keys. The Atocha sank on a reef, her cargo lost beneath the sea. For decades, Spain tried in vain to recover the treasure, but the wreck lay hidden. Centuries later, in 1985, treasure hunter Mel Fisher and his team discovered the remains of the Atocha. What they found stunned the world. More than 40 tons of silver and gold, along with jewels of extraordinary beauty. The wreck became one of the greatest maritime treasure discoveries in history, a modern reminder of the fortunes once carried by Spain's galleons. The Battle of Cartagena de Indias, 1741. As the galleon era drew toward its end, they still played crucial roles in war. During the War of Jenkins's Ear, a massive British fleet under Admiral Edward Vernon attacked the Spanish stronghold of Cartagena in present-day Colombia. Spanish galleons, alongside fortifications, formed part of the defense under the command of Blas de Lezo, a one-eyed, one-armed, and one-legged admiral. Despite overwhelming numbers, the Spanish forces and their galleons resisted fiercely. The British were repelled with heavy losses. The galleons of Cartagena, though aging by mid-18th century standards, demonstrated their continued relevance as floating fortresses. The battle preserved Spain's control of its Caribbean possessions and stands as one of the great defensive victories of the galleon age. Legends of ghost galleons beyond recorded battles and shipwrecks. The galleons left behind legends that haunt maritime lore. Sailors whispered of phantom galleons seen in stormy seas, shimmering silhouettes of ships long sunk, doomed to sail forever. In the Caribbean, tales spread of treasure. Galleons lost to reefs, their holds still brimming with gold, guarded by curses or spirits of drowned sailors. Such legends fueled treasure hunts for centuries. Every discovery of a wreck, like the Atocha or the San José, sunk in 1708 and rediscovered in 2015, rekindled these stories, blurring the line between myth and history. The San José, 1708. Another legendary galleon was the San José, part of a fleet ambushed by the British near Cartagena in 1708. The San José, carrying one of the richest cargoes ever assembled, gold, silver, and emeralds bound for Spain, exploded during the battle and sank to the bottom of the sea. For centuries, its treasure was sought, becoming a holy grail of shipwrecks. In 2015, the wreck was discovered off Colombia, with its cargo estimated at billions of dollars in value. Yet beyond the riches, the San José symbolizes the fate of many galleons, destroyed in the clash of empires, leaving behind both legend and loss. Catastrophes at sea. Not all galleons met dramatic ends in battle. Many simply succumbed to the ocean. Hurricanes in the Caribbean claimed dozens, storms in the Atlantic swallowed others. Sometimes fire broke out on board, consuming wooden hulls in minutes. One account tells of the Nuestra Señora de las Maravillas, lost in 1656 off the Bahamas while returning from Havana. Carrying immense treasure, she struck another ship in her own fleet during the night, then ran aground on a reef. But nearly 650 aboard, and about 45 survived. For centuries, divers have recovered parts of her cargo, yet much remains hidden beneath shifting sands. Such tragedies remind us that the galleon, for all its strength, is still a fragile thing against the might of the sea. The galleons as targets of pirates. The galleons also lived in constant fear of pirates. The Caribbean of the 17th century swarmed with buccaneers, freebooters, and privateers who dreamed of capturing a treasure ship. Though few pirates succeeded in seizing a fully loaded galleon, its guns and soldiers usually proved too formidable. The dream was enough to fuel countless raids on ports, coastal towns, and smaller ships. In popular imagination, the galleon became the ultimate prize, the glittering goal of every pirate's ambition. Even today, tales of pirates chasing treasure galleons fill novels and films, cementing their place in global folklore. The long decline. By the late 17th and 18th centuries, the galleon began to fade. Naval technology advanced. Ships of the line, purpose-built for warfare, eclipsed galleons in battle. For commerce, lighter and faster vessels like the Floyd and frigate became preferable. Yet galleons lingered, especially in the Manila trade, until the early 1800s. Their long decline did not erase their legacy. Each battle fought, each fleet wrecked, and each treasure ship lost added layers to their legend. Thus, the galleons lived lives of drama, marked by triumphs and disasters that reverberated across oceans. From the thunder of broadsides at Cartagena to the silent resting place of treasure on the seabed, the stories continue to shape our memory of the age of sail. When the last galleon sailed into history, its timbers weathered and its sails torn, the ship itself may have vanished, but the image of the Spanish galleon never truly disappeared. It survived in story, legend, and cultural memory, becoming one of the most enduring symbols of the age of sail. Galleons in literature. The galleon entered the world of literature as both reality and myth. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Chroniclers and poets describe the voyages of treasure fleets and the terror of pirate raids. Later, in the Romantic Age, writers wove galleons into their tales of adventure. Novels about buried treasure and haunted seas often mentioned the lost galleon, a ship heavy with gold and silver, lying silent beneath the waves. One example comes from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's 19th century poem, The Spanish Galleon, which evokes a vision of grandeur and tragedy at sea. In countless ballads and adventure stories, the word galleon itself became shorthand for mystery, wealth, and danger. Even modern adventure fiction, from Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island to contemporary novels, owes part of its imagery to the ghostly memory of these ships. Galleons, in art artists, too, found inspiration in the galleon's silhouette, towering stern, high forecastle, and billowing sails. Paintings from the golden age of Dutch seascapes often depicted Spanish galleons locked in battle with leaner, faster enemies. Later, romantic artists portrayed them as majestic, storm-battered leviathans, struggling against the fury of the ocean. Their shape, unique, instantly recognizable, became a visual symbol of exploration, conquest, and imperial wealth. Even today, model galleons are displayed in maritime museums and collectors' homes, not only as historical reconstructions, but as works of art in miniature. Galleons in film and popular culture cinema embrace the galleon as the quintessential treasure ship. From early black and white pirate films to modern blockbusters, directors have used galleons as dramatic backdrops for duels, storms, and plundering. The treasure galleon trope appears in Captain Blood, 1935, The Seahawk, 1940, and more recently in the Pirates of the Caribbean series. In these films, the galleon is more than a vessel. It is a stage upon which freedom and tyranny, greed and heroism clash beneath tattered sails. Video games have also adopted the galleon's image. Titles like Assassin's Creed 4, Black Flag allow players to command such ships, turning history into interactive legend. Through film, television, and games, galleons continue to sail in the imagination of millions who may never have heard of the Atocha or the San José, but who feel the magic of the word galleon. Galleons in national memory. For Spain, the galleon is both a symbol of imperial grandeur and of the costs of empire. The golden age of the galleons is remembered with pride as they carried silver that built cathedrals, palaces, and cities. Yet it is also recalled with melancholy. The treasure drained away in wars, the ships lost to storms, and the empire that eventually declined. In the Philippines, Mexico, and Latin America, the Manila galleons are remembered as lifelines of trade, but also as symbols of colonial rule. Their voyages linked distant continents, but they also carried goods, people, and ideas in ways that transformed local cultures. In the Caribbean, tales of treasure, galleons fuel legends that blend history with folklore, becoming part of local identity. A fisherman spotting a distant silhouette at dusk might whisper of a ghost galleon, returning once more from Havana to Seville. Maritime museums and replicas. Today, maritime museums across the world preserve the memory of the galleon. In Seville, the Archivo General de Indias holds documents chronicling the fleets. In Manila, exhibitions recall the centuries of trans-Pacific voyages. Several replicas of galleons have been built in recent decades. The most famous is El Galeón Andalucía, a full-scale reconstruction launched in 2010. This ship has sailed across the Atlantic and Pacific, visiting ports as a floating museum. On board, visitors walk among wooden decks, towering masts, and the cramped quarters of sailors, experiencing firsthand the atmosphere of the 17th century. Such replicas allow us not only to remember, but to feel the presence of these ships, how they creaked, how they smelled of tar and salt, and how they carried both dreams and despair across the seas. Folklore and ghost stories. Legends of ghost galleons remain especially strong in the folklore of seafaring nations. Sailors claim to have seen spectral ships drifting in moonlight, their sails glowing, their decks empty. Some say these apparitions are warnings of storms or death. In the Caribbean, divers sometimes tell of hearing bells beneath the sea, bells of sunken galleons calling from the deep. In coastal villages, elders recount stories of ships cursed by greed, destined to sink no matter how carefully steered. Whether or not such tales hold truth, they reflect a cultural memory that sees the galleon not just as a vessel of wood and iron, but as a living spirit of an age now gone. The galleon as a symbol. Today, the word galleon carries meanings beyond its technical definition. It symbolizes wealth and risk, ambition and downfall, conquest and tragedy. For historians, it is a reminder of the first truly global economy, silver mined in the Andes, carried by llamas to the coast, shipped on galleons across the Atlantic, spent in European wars, and even carried onward to China via Manila. For poets and storytellers, the galleon is a dream, a ship heavy with mystery, always sailing toward the horizon, but never quite reaching port. For modern nations, the galleon remains part of their heritage, sometimes celebrated, sometimes mourned, but always remembered. Thus, even though the last galleon rotted away centuries ago, its shadow sails on, in books, in art, in film, in folklore, and in the very identity of peoples once touched by its voyages. The story of the Spanish galleons is not merely about ships of wood and sail. It is the story of an empire at its height, of oceans turned into highways of gold and silver, and of an age when the fate of nations could be decided by a single storm or a single battle at sea. From their birth in the shipyards of Seville and the Basque Country to their voyages across the Atlantic and Pacific, galleons carried more than cargo. They carried empires upon their decks. Each voyage linked worlds, Europe with the Americas, Asia with Spain, and distant cultures with one another. They were ships of triumph and tragedy. Some returned laden with treasure, greeted by cheering crowds and ringing bells. Others vanished into storms, leaving only broken timbers upon a distant shore. Some were captured, their gold spilling into the coffers of Spain's rivals. And some became legends, ghost ships seen on dark horizons, or treasures still glittering beneath the sea. The galleon embodied both the promise and the peril of the early modern world. It symbolized wealth beyond imagination, yet also the dangers of over-reliance on fragile wooden hulls in a hostile ocean. It carried not only riches but also the heavy burdens of empire, conquest, colonization, and the flow of peoples and cultures across oceans. In their time, galleons inspired awe. Their towering sterns and massive broadsides stood as marvels of naval engineering. Their voyages represented courage and endurance, for the sailors who crewed them faced hunger, thirst, disease, and danger at every turn. In the centuries since, galleons have become symbols of something larger than themselves. In art and story, they represent adventure, the lure of distant horizons, and the mystery of the sea. In history, they marked the first great wave of globalization, when silver from Peru reached markets in China, and goods from Manila arrived in Seville. Today, replicas like the Galleon Andalusia and the treasures of the Atocha remind us that these ships were real, that their voyages were not just legends, but living history. Museums, literature, and films ensure that the image of the galleon still sails across our collective imagination. Above all, the galleon teaches us about the fragility of power. Spain's fleets carried unimaginable wealth, yet storms, pirates, and rival navies humbled even the mightiest ships. In this lesson, the galleon is both a symbol of grandeur and a reminder of humility before the sea. And so, though the last true galleon crumbled into dust long ago, its spirit endures. In the whisper of waves upon a quiet shore, in the creak of timbers in a reconstructed hull, and in the endless fascination with lost treasure, the galleon still sails. Its voyage, it seems, will never end.